All right, whenever you all are ready.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming out this morning in the US and this evening in Europe. And I'm Tammy Proctor. I'm one of the co-editors of the journal. I'm here with my co-editor, Nadia Durbach, and my other vital member of the editorial team, our assistant editor, Chelsea Rutke. And we just thought we would kind of go through the process with some slides here just to kind of get us started. And then at the end, we'll take some Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and then we'll take turns. The three of us will take turns presenting. So you'll hear from all of us as part of the presentation. Can everybody see the slides okay? Yep. Okay, great. Um, Okay, so today what we're going to talk about is the review process. And for some of you, it'll probably seem pretty basic what we're talking about, because we're going to go through step by step. But I kind of wish I'd had this when I was early in my career and even later in my career. I've learned a lot about the review process over the years that I didn't know. So we're hoping to kind of demystify it a little bit here. Okay, so first thing first, and I will say in the United States, this is sometimes referred to in different ways by university administrations and by review committees for things like grants. But the gold standard is a double anonymous review, or you'll see double blind peer review sometimes. And in my university, which is very science oriented, we often have to explain what that means in our annual reviews. So here's kind of the main way that double anonymous review works. But again, you can check with a journal if you want to know a little bit more about how they do this. So the idea is several experts will read the submission. They don't know who wrote it. We anonymize all of our articles, and most journals should do that. So that means that if there's something that might identify the author in the text or in the footnotes, we remove that. Um, the historian also doesn't know who the reviewers are, and usually that remains the case because reviewers don't usually say, I read that piece even after it's been published. So the experts provide feedback to the journal. The editorial team reads it. We use it to make a decision. And then we convey it to the author, regardless of whether we accept or reject the article at that point or whether we ask for revisions. We always try to share the feedback to the author so that they have a sense of what's going on. The author revises, then they resubmit. Um, and then the experts read it again. And in our case, a lot of times we send it to one of the first reviewers to kind of look at it in relation to the other commenters' uh, remarks. And then they make another recommendation to us. The journal then uses it to make a decision. So it's a pretty involved process, and we try to keep it anonymous throughout as much as possible. Um, okay, this is a big question. Will I need to revise? I think it's extremely rare for any article to be accepted without any revisions. Um, Sometimes you'll get back comments that say, you just need to do minor revisions. It doesn't go back to external reviewers. Means that they're not cosmetic necessarily, but they're things that wouldn't change the article in any considerable way. And so they would be sort of seen as minor revisions. But the real common thing is that they just are accepted only after they've gone through a pretty thorough review. And the revisions are sometimes quite substantial. And I think that's the thing you should expect. And we're happy to talk about this in the Q&A. I mean, personally, I've never had an article accepted without at least some revisions, even if they're just minor ones. And most of the times I've had to do pretty major revisions, and I'm sure Nadia and Chelsea can talk about their experiences as well. Okay, so criteria for publication. The main things that we're looking for and that you should think about when you read an article before you submit it, does it make a new contribution to existing knowledge about a field? And here the journal audience is really important, and I think we'll talk about this more in some of the later slides. But think a little bit about what it would look like to make a new contribution, in our case, in British studies. It has to speak to something beyond your narrow subfield. It has to be fresh in some way. So really consider when you look at your article before you send it off, like what field am I most hoping to make an impact? We look for appropriate and sufficient evidence to support the argument. It can be beautifully written and have great claims, but if it's not adequately supported, it won't be published. It has to be clearly and persuasively written. So, just the flip side, it can have a lot of great evidence, but if it's hard to slog through it and you can't really see the narrative, then it's probably not going to make the cut either. Citations should be appropriate. And here, just make sure you look at the journal guidelines, whether it's JBS or any other journal. We tell you what we want, and we really appreciate it if you put it in the appropriate style. If you're submitting to JBS and it's in MLA style, we're going to send it back to you without even reading it and ask you to put in footnotes. So, you really need to think about the style. It needs to engage with scholarship in the field, and that is, again, kind of a non-negotiable. And then the last thing, I guess, is adhering to professional standards. And, this can be a little squishy, but showing respect to other authors is, I think, an important part of scholarly debate, and we hope that that's what we'll get from our authors. Okay, that was kind of if you're submitting something overview. If you're asked to review a manuscript, here are a few things to think about, and I'll give you a couple and then I'm going to turn it over to Nadia to talk a little more about this. But when you receive an invitation to review, I think you want to consider a lot of the practical questions. The first one is probably, do you have time to do this in the window that they're asking? And if you don't, say no. Because there's nothing worse than saying yes and then getting a series of reminders and realizing, and feeling guilty that you're not doing what you said you would. So really think about your time commitment and if you can do it. Also think about whether you're an expert in this topic or is this something really in your wheelhouse or not. And then you can decide whether to say yes or no. If you can do both of those things, the other plea we would make is please click yes or no immediately. Because what happens is sometimes people think, oh yeah, I'm going to do that, but they don't ever click the yes link. So we don't know if they're accepting or rejecting it. We really want to know if you're on board, because if you're not, we have to look for someone else. So even if you're planning to do it, 5 weeks hence, right before the deadline, if you can still let us know yes or no, that's really helpful. And then I think this question of, I guess it's sort of an equity question, the do a review audit. Have you agreed to be part of a scholarly community and reviewed articles in sort of the same way that you've been submitting them, asking others to review your own work? So think a little bit about reciprocity, I guess. Okay, I already kind of talked about this a little bit, but please meet your deadlines. And This is, again, something where you just have to be honest with yourself. Can I do it or not? If you don't have the time, just say no. And, it is very common that we'll get something from a reviewer saying, hey, I can't do it right now, but keep me in mind. In 3 months, I'm going to have a lot more time. I'm happy to do something then. But most reviewers don't want to hold up the publication process. And so they'll tell us if they don't. The other thing is be sure to give yourself plenty of time. It takes more time than you think it will. If you're close, you've read it, you've started your report, but you're not quite done. There's no harm in reaching out to an editor and saying, "Hey, I need a few more days," or "I'll get it to you, but here's the date I can get it to you." If you're ill, just reach out. Editors are happy to get information about when the review will come. Um, and then I think just being clear with the journal editors about where you are. If you start a review, this is, I think, something that a lot of people are maybe afraid to do, and you think you can't do it for some reason, conflict of interest, or something comes up, just write to the journal editors and withdraw if you have to. Okay, I think now I am turning it over to Nadia.
Yeah. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about sort of what your job is as a reviewer when you're giving the comments, and then what your job is as an author when you're receiving those comments. So some of this stuff will be really obvious, but sometimes people do reach out to us and say, sort of like, what are you looking for? What should I do? So obviously, the most important thing is you're providing a really thorough and really careful read of the manuscript. You may feel the need to read it more than once, but you're not required to do that if the first time through you're being really attentive and careful. And keeping an open mind about the argument is really important. Sometimes, as reviewers, we're thinking about our own work. And so someone's argument is contesting your work. And that might be why we've actually asked you to review it. And so it's really important to keep an open mind all the way through the process. And what you're paying attention to is how well supported is this argument? How novel is it? So paying attention, really closely to the argument and its relationship to the evidence. And that's why we're asking you always also to look at the footnotes, make sure the claims are properly supported. You're the expert in the field, so you know the historiography. So making sure this person has read the right kinds of material in the field. Are they missing something? Do they not seem to be engaging with scholarship that's already out there? And again, coming back to that idea that it's really important to leave aside your own work unless it's directly relevant. Try not to be sort of defensive about your own work, and also try not to make it about you. The review is about the author. It's not really about you, right? We also would really like your feedback on the clarity of the writing. Was this hard to get through or not? Sometimes something can be quite dense and it feels like it might not be written for people who are not specialists in the field. So let us know that, right? Like, this is a really strong argument. It'll be easy to read for specialists. For non-specialists, the author might need to kind of use some more subheadings, pull back a little bit. And obviously, the most important thing is that you're providing feedback that is constructive, that is polite, that is professional, and that, again, you're doing it in a timely manner. So really paying attention to your tone, which is another thing I want to talk about. Tammy, if you want to give me the next slide. Oh, this is, yeah, what the journal wants from a reviewer, but I'll get to tone in a sec. So again, please be reading thoroughly and carefully. This is what we're looking for. Write as much as you can because more feedback is always helpful. Now, I know this is a question people will ask in the Q&A. How much do I need to write? We get reviews that are 3 sentences. We just got a review that was 11 pages long. 3 sentences is not really enough. Even if it's an accept and you think this is great, you need to tell us why. So you need to be specific, and that's going to take a little bit more time, but we don't necessarily need 11 pages. So we need a few paragraphs, we need specifics, and we need some sense, again, of whether we're a generalist journal. And what we mean by that is we specialize in British studies, but there are people reading the journal who are medievalists, and there are people who work on the 21st century. So the themes that an article addresses needs to be sort of interesting or compelling to people, whatever period they work on. So we need to kind of know if, we have got manuscripts in the past that we understood were really important to the very specific subfield, but that generalist readers were not going to kind of attach themselves to. So telling us some of that information would be really helpful. Being really specific, that's what we want. What is it about this manuscript that still needs work? What is working really well? Again, we want the feedback on argument, evidence, organization. Um, we would like you to tell us and the author whether they need to read more secondary material and also whether they need to do more research. Tammy, can you give me the next slide?
I did. Is it not showing
Oh,
up?
there it is. Okay, it's the
I think
confidentiality and tone. Sorry, there was a
there's a
slightly delay
lag.
for me. Confidentiality and tone. This is so important. Um, your comments are going to be passed on to the author. So for our system, and this is probably true in every system, there's a space for comments to the author and a space to confidential comments to the editor. Anything that goes in the space comments to author will be passed on, probably in its entirety. So it's really important that even when you are critical, you use a tone that is constructive, professional, helpful, regardless of what you think about this manuscript. Please be helpful. Do not include anything that would identify you as a reviewer. Sometimes you need to refer to your own work. Do that in the third person, and I usually recommend bearing that in the list. It would be helpful if the author read the following other, books. Don't put yours first. Put it somewhere in the list. If you have confidential material that you would like to communicate to us as editors, there is a special box for that. Look carefully where you're putting your comments and put some material that's confidential to us in that box. People use this quite often to say things they're not super comfortable saying to authors. Um, so you can use that box as a reviewer, and I want you to think carefully about what's going to be read by the author and what you might just need to communicate with us confidentially. And you will want to really think as a reviewer about that tone. And if I was an author, is this the tone that I would like the review to be in? So thinking about, you might think this article is not worth publication, but how do you communicate that in a way that is professional? And I would just say also that sometimes even in the material that's in the box to be sent to the author, we will remove something that we think is unnecessarily rude or mean, or this doesn't happen a lot, but if we're seeing something in a review that we actually don't think is helpful, we'll just take it out. Okay, so when you are receiving feedback, then what is your job as an author then? So just as you're supposed to keep an open mind as a reviewer, it's really important that you keep an open mind when you get that feedback and you consider it thoroughly. Your instinct will immediately be to be defensive. Like, this is my work. I spent so hard on this. How can anyone tell me it's not ready for publication, right? Especially if, this has been a dissertation and you've been living with it maybe for 6 years, right? So you have to kind of put yourself in the frame of mind where, this is a community and you're getting feedback from your community and they want to help you. As a reviewer, you want to be helpful. So as an author, you also want to receive that feedback and you have to kind of know that people are being helpful to you. So that might mean like putting it in a drawer for a week before you're ready to receive the feedback. And I know Chelsea will talk a little bit more about this. So it's your job to take these reviews seriously. Someone has spent a lot of time doing this. The person who spent 11 pages doing this put a lot of time into that, right? So read everything they've suggested that you read. Consider carefully how these comments will help you strengthen your argument. And then start making those changes that are consistent with the argument you want to make, right? And this might mean you have to do a little bit more research. You might need to alter that argument if the reviewers don't think that you can support the original argument you want to make. Often you need to reorganize, that you're burying the lead, that nobody understands what is the main intervention that you're making. And so that might mean you need to reorganize, right? And you need to be really careful for reformatting according to what the style guide is for that journal as well. So, as part of your revision process, you want to think about that. So, I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea to talk about sort of the logistics of the revision process.
Thank you so much, Nadia. So, yes, we're going to be sticking now with you as the author, having gotten back the feedback from the reviewers. What do you do with this? So, as Tammy and Nadia have already mentioned, revision is hard. You have that very defensive mode. You'll often want to go into it first. But again, as Tammy mentioned, basically everything will go through a form of revision. And revision is not meant to be hurtful, it is meant to make your work stronger. To someone saying, there is a lot of good here, here's how to take it to the next level. Now, it is hard to go back to something that you've already spent all this time on, which is why I completely agree. Sometimes you need to set it aside. Maybe you don't look at the reviews immediately, or maybe you read the reviews, you set it aside, and then you can come back to it. But the most important thing once you get those reviews is first, you can decide, do you want to undertake these revisions? Sometimes people decide that they would rather take their article to a different journal instead, that would take less work, less reframing if it's for a more specific audience, for instance. However, if you do decide that you want to undertake these revisions, be incredibly realistic about your timeline. I think there's often a sense with people that they want to promise the shortest turnaround. And we would very much recommend against that. You're going to need time to sit with it. Many things will take longer than you expect, and you're doing this among all of your other deadlines. So be incredibly realistic. Give yourself a little bit of a buffer zone if you need. Now, this doesn't mean, say, you'll have it in a year, but maybe add a few weeks to your instinct. So be very realistic. Okay, so you've decided that you're going to read these revisions and then you can choose, are you going to undertake these or not? Read each reviewer's comments. Also read the editor's comments because often the editors will have gone through these different comments, kind of compiled them together, and also offer their opinions on what they want done. Now, because your reviewers are not speaking to each other, their reviews might not line up. One person might like something that another doesn't. One person might say you need more of this, and another says you need more of something else. So, kind of just make a note of all the different things that are getting flagged. But for this first step, you were just reading all of the comments, kind of making a note. Is this a tone comment? Is this an argument comment? Is this a formatting comment? Just processing all of that. And then maybe that's when you set it aside for a second. So it's read and absorb. Next is what I find to be the most helpful part, making a checklist. And you can do this whichever style works best for you, or maybe combine some of these different styles. So one way is to maybe print up both the reviews and your own article and then highlight all the sections that the reviewer's comments speak to, and then make a note, maybe add sticky tabs about the things that need to be done in this area. You can also do this on the Word document itself using the highlighter function, using the comment function to insert introduction needs to be reshaped, add to historiography here. Another thing you can do is actually take your article and even cut it up paragraph by paragraph and then cut up the comments and match it up. So whether you want to be more technical or more hands-on, you can convert the comments into a list in a Word document using bullet points. And then the other version you can do is making a list by hand. I like to use a whiteboard. So I have a big whiteboard over here, and I will divide up my article or my book by the sections and then kind of make columns of, Here are the formatting changes. Here's tone changes. Here's research changes. And then I can kind of try to, throughout the time, let me get 2 checks this week from these different areas. So adopt whichever strategy works for you, but combine those comments into your document. So we mentioned before, maybe the feedback is contradictory. What do you do then? The first thing you should do is go back to those editors' comments because often they will have resolved that issue for you. They will have pointed out which is the side that they're leaning towards or which they think is more important. Particularly if is there a discrepancy about the way they want you to pitch this to the audience. The next one is also, this is still your article. What is ultimately the path that you want to take with this? Sometimes you will get revision suggestions that is not how you are trying to argue. It's not what you're trying to argue. So that might tell you that you need to reframe your argument to be clearer. So, what are the suggestions that will help you get to what is your point? What is your end goal? And if you're ever lost or if you're ever confused about which of these to prioritize, reach back out to the editors. Editors are very, very kind and wonderful and have gone through this process with their own work and have helped so many people through it. They do not mind if you reach out to them and say, what would you like me to do? I'm stuck between these two, or is it okay if I do this? All right. Very, very scary list. What do you do first? There's basically two main theories. You do the easy things first. Fix your footnotes. Take them from APA style to Chicago style. The other one is do the hardest things first. Reformat your argument. Change your introduction. Reparse your historiography. They're both very, very valid. With when I do my big checklist, I kind of tend to bounce between the two. It's kind of where my brain is at that day. I let it dictate which direction I go. The one thing that I will say is don't do all the superficial edits if you're going to have to change that entire paragraph. You don't want to make extra work for yourself. So easy, hard, both are valid, but just make sure you're not doubling your work. We live in a very distracted screen era. People absolutely will do these things while watching TV, listening to an audiobook. So what works when? Well, again, those very simplistic things, adding your subheadings, reformatting your footnotes, which I know you will all do lovingly, painstakingly, making sure that everything follows the proper format so you will be nice to the journal's assistant editor. You can do that in front of a TV um, using the style guide. So those kind of just more rote process things. That's fine if you want to do that while relaxing. However, things you do not want to do while you are catching up on the latest Netflix or HBO show, the major revisions, the restructuring your argument, the defending your position, clarifying your points more. Those are the major revisions. That needs particular time for it. It's not all done in one day. Again, you don't have to do it in order. That's again why I like my whiteboard checklist. I can bounce around, but still see that I'm getting somewhere. And it's things you might have to come back to. You might have to take a break, go for a walk, think it through. Um, this is really where you need to sell the editors and the reviewers the most that this does deserve to be published.
Okay,
Okay,
this
I'm
is
gonna go
me
back to
again.
Nadia now.
All right, so how do you know when it's done, right? So if you've done your checklist, is everything crossed off your list? And that's why actually doing that checklist is really important because then you will actually see when you've hit all those points. For me, in terms of writing, I find I reach a point where things are getting different. Like I'm tinkering, revising this, but it's not necessarily making a difference in terms of clarity of my argument. So if you're tinkering with the words here and there, like then that's not really like making it better, then you're probably done with that. And I think at that point you need to read it out loud. And I think that's really important because you will catch your own writing ticks and you'll catch the sentences that are way too long that way. So I think, all right, have you done your list? Is the writing at this point just, moving stuff around? And what does it actually sound like? Then you're ready to send it back to the journal. Okay, so what to do when you've reached that point then? You're going to resubmit it to the journal following their instructions for resubmission. And I think it's really helpful, certainly for us. Most authors do not do this, but it's actually very helpful for us or for whatever the journal you're sending it to, is to include a letter that indicates what you actually did. What some authors will do that's really helpful is they'll kind of actually even put back the revisions they got and then address underneath that, these are what I did based on what the author suggested. So that means you're telling us what you didn't do as well. Like, why didn't you do this? Someone suggested you did this. Why did you choose not to do that? That's super, super helpful. It's helpful for us to see like how your brain is working, what decisions you actively made. But we will also generally, when we send the revised manuscript back to one of the original reviewers, we'll send this letter. And that's why we ask it to be anonymized, not on your letterhead, not with your name on it, because that is really, really helpful for us to be able to then send the document back and say, this is what the author has done. And what we'll send back we'll send your revised manuscript. We'll send that letter if you wrote one, and the original reviewer will get their original review back, plus all the other reviews that they haven't seen yet to see what other people suggested. So if you've got a document that says, these are the other reviews I got, and this is what I did to address them, that's really, really helpful. And I would also just say at some point in this process, if this gets accepted, please do include in an acknowledgement that thanks those anonymous reviewers. They've put a lot of time into it. And so that's really polite and acknowledges again that you are part of this community. And that's really what we want to end with today, is that thinking about the review process, both as an author getting reviews, but also as the reviewer writing these reviews, you are part of this community of scholars. And that is how knowledge is produced. It is produced through this peer review process. And so it is produced really by participating in this community of expertise. And that is the best way to think about the review process, so that when you get those reviews back as an author, you're thinking about the time that your community put into this. And when you're thinking about whether you want to do a review or not, you're thinking about contributing back to your community. And that's one of the most important things that we think about constantly at the journal, is that we are just sort of like a little hub, a node in this wider British Studies community. And so when you get that invitation to review, really thinking to yourself, how can I contribute back to this community that I have benefited from? Doing a review is part of that. And when you get the reviews, thinking to yourself, well, I want to do justice to this community that is helping me. And so just to circle back to something that Chelsea said, you sort of if you're deciding you do want to revise, or maybe you need to send it to a more specialist journal, even if you decide not to revise for the original journal, you should still make as many of those revisions as possible before sending it elsewhere, because doing that really acknowledges other people's work and expertise. Even if you ultimately decide you chose the wrong journal, it was the wrong audience, you still want to make as many revisions as possible. So I think we'll stop there so that we have time for Q&A, which we'll just open up.
Yeah. And actually, can I just add one thing to what you just said, Nadia? If you get the reviews back, in our case, it's usually 3 reviewers who look at something. And as editors, we write and say, we're going to pass on this right now. Here are the reviews. Here's, some of the reasons why. Don't just assume it's a terrible article and that you're done. What usually you can do is take those reviewers' comments and reframe it for another journal, because 9 times out of 10, what we get back from the reviewers is just that it's not a great fit for British studies for these reasons. But this would be great for, these 5 other journals. So really, don't be discouraged if it comes back with comments and a rejection. It's still part of that larger process Nadia was talking about.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up with that by saying we actually try really hard if we're not going to take something to tell you which one or two journals we think it would be a good fit for, just because of our kind of knowledge of the other journals out there. So have a look at that and think about that. And I also really want to underscore what Tammy just said. Sometimes it's just not right for us. And so read that seriously. The other thing I would just want to say, because this has come up a couple times when we've done presentations, revise and resubmit is 90% of what we get, even from extremely senior experienced scholars. They still have to do this. And it means we're excited to work with you on this article. Somebody once said, "Oh, I just thought that meant you weren't that interested in my article." That's not what it means. It means we're excited to work with you on this article. But like everything else, like 90% of everything we do, it needs a little bit more work or a lot more work. So every time you get a revise and resubmit, you should read that as this journal is excited to work with me on this article.
Okay, questions, comments, anything you'd like to know? We have plenty of time, so.
Uh, Firstly,
Yeah, go
thank you
ahead.
very much for this wonderful and informative presentation. I have two questions, one kind of from the reviewer side and one from the reviewee side. Um, if you've reached out to someone asking them to review a manuscript and they say, I'd love to help, but I really can't make that work in my schedule at this time. How many times do you get that response before you go, I'm going to stop asking that guy?
Well, I don't think we stop. So one thing that we can tell in our system in Editorial Manager is whether we've asked somebody too many times, or if they've rejected, you know, five five requests in a row. Um, so I mean, I think that we don't really stop asking. I'll let Nadia address this too, but we do want to be sensitive about people's times or where they are in their careers. And, occasionally we'll get people who will decline and then they'll give us a timeline like, I just can't do anything for the next year, or I have a newborn and I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to do this. So I think that we don't really stop asking
Yeah.
people unless they tell us to. Does that
And
seem
also
right?
because there's a human being on the other end of this
Yes,
process, you
exactly.
take the reasons for a
Yeah.
decline into
Oh,
consideration.
yeah,
Okay,
we
cool.
wouldn't write anybody off. And there is a little box that says why you can't do it. And, people usually don't fill that out, but often they'll just say, I'm so swamped, ask me in 3 months. Or, it's nice to fill something out there if you can. Especially nice to suggest other people who might be good reviewers because we don't, sometimes that's why I'm asking someone. I'm like, oh, I'm sure this person isn't going to do this review for whatever reason, but I'm sure they will have a good suggestion for me.
Mhm.
So, yeah, so we don't write off reviewers as, no.
We just had
Excellent.
one recently that just wrote in large capital letters with exclamation point stress. And I figure that's somebody I don't go back to for a little while.
Highly relatable. Yeah.
Yes.
And then the author side question. So I recently from a different journal I got feedback where one of my reviewers said in a fairly non-anonymous way, "Oh, I think you haven't considered my book in writing this." And part of the issue was I had considered their book and I just disagreed with them. And I in very concrete terms, I understand that I can decline a suggested revision, but in terms of doing that politely and professionally, saying, I think you've missed the argument of my work, or I did understand the argument of your work and disagree with it for these reasons based on this evidence. It's like, how can one phrase that or frame that diplomatically?
Mhm. Well, I'll start and let everybody else weigh in here because I'm sure we all have ideas. I think that one of the things you can do is see if the editors gave you any idea about how to address this. If they didn't, I think when you turn your revisions in, you can say in a note to the editor, look, it wasn't that I ignored this. Here are my reasons why, this isn't central. Another thing you can do is just drop in a footnote that says other work on this topic by dot, dot, dot. I don't know that you want to go in and say, I disagree with this person because that
Yeah.
changes your article, right? You don't want to do that.
Right. Then it
It's
becomes
probably
about
worth
that disagreement instead of that disagreement just being tangential to the actual argument. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. What do you think, Nadia?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not central to the argument, like if the argument that you're making is not built on actually suggesting something quite different in the field, and that's not your intervention, what people often do is they put a footnote and they say, for an alternative view, see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with both of them of that this is a great time to consult the editor about is this even a big deal to the editors? Do they read this as something very, very concerning that needs to be addressed? Adding in a footnote. Sometimes it's even just adding a clarifying sentence about what your intervention is. That is not directed at this person and saying you disagree with their work, but just saying like the goal of this piece is really to make this discussion, to make this
Mhm.
argument. Sometimes that can help too.
Yeah, you can, it's usually one sentence you can add, like previous scholarship has argued blah, 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 and then footnote, and then
Right. Right.
I'm
I,
like,
however, am
good.
going in this other
Some people
direction
just
about this other thing.
Yeah,
So if
we,
you need to do this
some
type of
people
analysis, I'm doing this other version of this.
mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
some
Thank you.
people just
Very,
want to
very
make sure
helpful.
they're cited.
Yes, there's something in the
Uh,
notes
Mhm.
in the chat.
okay. From Sheila, thank you for the seminar. If we were asked to review a manuscript that needs a lot of work, how should we decide whether to A, leave detailed feedback and recommend revise and resubmit, or B, recommend that the article is not yet ready for publication? Where's the line? Some journals have an additional option to reject and resubmit, which I think makes things even more complicated. Do you want to take that, Nadia?
Yeah, so we don't have that reject and resubmit, and you should not worry too much about whether you're in that situation recommending reject or major revision. Those are two options you would go with because we'll make that final decision ourselves whether we think this is just too much work at this stage and really needs to be rejected. So you as the reviewer need not worry too much about your final recommendation, and you can put that in confidential comments to us. Reviewers will often say, it's really on the fence between major revision and reject. So just mostly focus on your comments, and we'll make that decision in the end, but being as detailed as you can for the author about what might need to be done. But yeah, don't stress about the recommendation because that's mostly in our hands and not yours. Does
Hmm.
that does
And
that answer
remember,
your
there'll
question,
be,
Sheila?
yeah, and there'll be other reviewers too. So I think people have different personal lines between things like minor and major, or what they think is minor versus major. And sometimes we'll get, two reviewers. One will say minor and there'll be 11 pages, and the other will say major and there'll be one line. So that's our job, is to figure that out. But I think just kind of make your best guess about what you think it would take to turn this into an article that would be accepted.
Mhm. And something that might be helpful as well is that we're not asking the reviewers to do line edits, to correct grammar, to correct footnotes, or anything like that. That is something that will come down the line and come from us. If you want to include a comment about difficulty in understanding the language, that's fine, but that is not on you to fix.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Although I
It is
will
helpful.
say one thing that is really helpful is that if you're an expert in the field and you see like somebody's name, it has been spelt wrong because they have a really alternative spelling that we wouldn't necessarily know as editors, that this historical actor, actually the spelling of their name has extra L's in it or something. Do say that because we wouldn't necessarily catch that. And hopefully our copy editor would catch that. But just that's a helpful line edit.
Mhm.
But yeah,
I was
other
going to
stuff
say
don't
the same
bother.
thing. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, that sometimes if it's about a historical fact or a spelling, it is helpful to say, on page 7, the wrong century is listed here, or, something, there's a mistake, so that we know to flag it.
Mhm.
Other questions? Got a few minutes left if anybody else has questions.
You can ask us anything.
I mean, I'll just say that I think Nadia and Tammy do a great job of processing and parsing the reviews that we get in. Reviewer two is a meme and a thing for a reason, but I think JBS offers a very wonderful experience of toning down when we do get those reviewer two feedbacks. So I just want to give the praise to Tammy and Nadia because I think that's wonderful.
Thanks, Chelsea. And Chelsea does an amazing job of, checking all your footnotes and stuff. So there will be another person looking at them.
And we do have another level of copy editing from Cambridge. So the article goes through various stages and a lot of correspondence back and forth. So you can expect that too, even after turning in revisions. Nicola.
Hi, incredibly helpful. I've never seen it laid out that well. Really, really helpful. I just wondered if I could pick your brains a bit about the difference between a generalist academic journal and a specialist academic journal, and the kind of pitch level you guys are looking for academic historians for whom this is not their period, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So there's journals that are like completely generalist, like Past and Present, American Historical Review, that they'll just accept everything. We're kind of in the middle level because we only accept stuff on British studies. And of course, people do extractive reading. They don't read everything. I mean, some people maybe read everything in the journal. Most people don't. So they're looking for stuff that's really in their subject area. But for us, I think we err on the side of inclusivity, and we understand that some of our articles maybe are going to have more specialist readers, but there sort of has to be something in it that we think, well, someone who doesn't work in this area still has to think that there's something here for them, right? Because it speaks to something bigger. So again, I'm not going to name this article specifically, but the best example that comes to mind is this thing we got a few years ago that I remember just being like, oh, I know this is important, but only to a handful of people. I know this is going to get published, but I can't find the hook. I can't find why this very particular debate would be meaningful to anybody else, even though I understand it to be good historical work. So there has to be some kind of hook for us. And we've said this over and over again in different places. There's no harm sending it to us. We are kind reviewers, and we will tell you if we think probably this should be submitted somewhere else. And we would do that quickly too. So if we get something in within a few days, we will have decided whether, this is something we think could be something for our journal. So we're going to read it, or whether we look at it, we read the abstract and we're like, oh, this is way too specific. This needs to go to this kind of, so there's no drawback to sending it to us, because we will always advise if it should go somewhere else. We keep the most open mind. Tammy, do you think that?
Yeah, and I think this is where the writing comes in, is important. So if it's written in a really clear and persuasive way, and you think that somebody in another, chronological field or another area of British studies would find it interesting, it's probably worth sending to us. And I'll just give you an example. We just had one published at the end of last year on sick leave in medieval Britain. And I work on 19th and 20th century, and I think I know what sick leave is. But then I read the article, and it really made me think a lot more about the longer prehistory to this concept. So, that's just one example. But I think that if it's something that you think will engage people, it's worth sending to us.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Something that might be useful as well is thinking about the journal you're pitching it to is almost the way that you would frame um, a talk that you give at a conference as well, knowing if you're at a 16th century conference or an English theological conference or a very wide generalist audience, and you kind of reshape your terminology and the amount of background you give. And it's completely valid to decide, I need to go into so much specific detail here that if I took the time to explain all these terms, that would be using up so much of my word count. That's a great hint to go to a more specific journal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, there's another question in the chat. If a manuscript pushes back against a specific scholar's work and that scholar is an ideal expert to review, what's the calculus on actually asking that person to review?
It's such a good question. What is our answer to that question? Sometimes it just depends on the person.
Mhm.
If we know that that person is a generous scholar, um, we'll be happy to send it to them. Sometimes we know that someone is, perhaps has not demonstrated at conferences that they are that open to, then we deliberately won't. Um, and again, if we got a review back that we thought was unnecessarily defensive or mean, we would edit it or not send it on. And again, we put it into a context. So we might, in that sense, get an extra review. Sometimes we get 4 reviews just by chance or just because we need another person for us to be able to make a decision. So it really depends on that particular case. But we would not, we read things carefully and we understand that this is okay. This person is in conflict with this other person. We might, you know, not send it to that person. Yeah, we think about these things. Let's put it that way. It's case by case, but we do think about these things quite carefully.
Mhm. Yeah, and it is helpful that we have multiple reviews because we can also send it to other people who are established in that field and have them comment, you know, on it, especially if it's a debate like this. I think there is some good in sending it to the scholar because then the author has feedback about how this is going to be received if it's published too. So, yeah, kind of falling back on Nadia's answer that we think about it carefully, but we wouldn't shy away, I think, automatically from sending it to somebody in that case.
Mm. And it might be helpful just to tell you guys how we find reviewers, because we do that in multiple different ways. So number one, we just know a lot of people in the field. We know who works on what. So just based on our own knowledge of who works on things, we look in your footnotes. So we look to see, who are you engaging in the scholarship? Who has written about this? Who are you citing? Because those are the people who are going to be most interested in reading your work. They also work on this. So we go to the footnotes. So that's why that sentence that says for an alternative view is helpful to us as well, because we're like, oh, this is a scholar who's taken a different position on this. That might be someone worth asking to review or not. Like, so we look in your footnotes. We have a database of reviewers. Obviously, it's really actually quite difficult to navigate for these purposes. It's not specific enough. I look in historical abstracts, who else has written on this recently, look for books recently published. I Google sometimes, like who's working on these 3 keywords.
Mhm.
And then we get suggestions from people who turn us down. So
And
those
our associate editors. So we
associate editors, yeah.
often send articles that are not something Nadia and I know anything about, or Chelsea. Like if none of the 3 of us are really in that field, we really rely on our editorial board and our associate editors, and we send it to them first and say, is this worth reviewing? And if so, who are the top 3 or 4 people you send it to? And I find that super helpful.
Yeah.
Something to note off of that, which I don't think we've brought up before, but kind of goes back to Nadia's comments about make sure, even if you decide not to continue with one journal, to take the feedback under consideration and to try to implement it. If you submit an article that was previously rejected somewhere else, it might be offered back to that same original reviewers. Oftentimes they will turn it down, they won't review it again, but they might pass on their original review so that we're aware if things have changed, if things were implemented. So do keep that in mind.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you don't, the risk is if you don't revise based on the comments and you just send it to another journal, it's going to go back in some cases to the same reviewers. And like this happens to me all the time. And I'll be like, hey, I already reviewed this for this journal, a month ago. It looks like exactly the same article. Like, and then that really puts off the editors of the second journal you sent it to, like, oh, you thought we didn't need the revised version, so But in the past, when reviewers say to us, I already reviewed this for another journal, I have asked to see that review. And then I've looked and been like, oh, they did everything this reviewer said. And this is a very different article now. And so that's really helpful for us. So it's, we share things. So don't think it can go completely, as a blank slate to a new journal. Yeah.
Yeah. And I should say, I don't think we've said it yet, that we also reject things without sending it out for review. And usually we do that if we think already that it's not going to be a good fit, because we don't want to hold up your publication. And we want you to be able to send it to something that might be more appropriate to the audience that you're aiming for.
Mhm.
Sheila.
Thanks again for this session. This is really great. If we are rejected from one journal and then accepted by another one, how do we thank the reviewers of the previous journal from which we were rejected?
Mhm.
Uh,
That's a
Not
great,
sure. Good question.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting.
I think I would say something like, I'd like to thank the several anonymous reviewers who gave feedback during my revision process. And then that signals that, maybe you got revisions from somewhere else too.
That sounds good. Yeah, it seems awkward and you don't want to say this was rejected here, but
I
then I
wouldn't
tried
name,
again.
yeah. I wouldn't name the other journal. Like there's no
Yeah,
need to do
Mhm.
that, but you can just say that.
That's
yeah.
good. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're at 11, so my time. So it's been an hour. Um, Thank you all for coming and for engaging with us, and we're happy to answer questions. We will be at NACBS in California, and we usually try to have a session of some kind. So if you've got an idea for a session you'd like to see, send us a note. I think we're pretty open to that. Anything else, Nadia?
Yeah, I would just kind of underscore that there's no harm in sending something to us, and if we don't think it's ready, we'll let you know. If we think another journal is better, we'll let you know, but we'll do it in a hopefully kind and constructive way for you. So, we are the journal of the NACBS, and if you're a member, we want you to think of us first. So that's it.
Chelsea?
I would say that we've had really good feedback from people that we went through the full revision process with, that they actually really enjoyed those back and forths, especially as we went on. So uh, I think it's been a great working experience with these two, and I've heard positive feedback of the same. So yeah, definitely give JBS a shot.
And I would say just one final word, that we're actually pretty hands-on editors. So even at the point where we've accepted your manuscript, there is another revision process. Like we've accepted it, we've said, yes, this is ready to go, but we actually do quite a little bit of work after that with you as an author. Sometimes we reorganize things for you, we query things. So there actually is an extra revision process that comes after acceptance that is, depending on the manuscript, can be also fairly intense in terms of like your intellectual thought about how this manuscript is going out into the world. So there is that extra process.
Okay. Well, thanks again, and thanks, Amanda, for running the Zoom and for organizing us and recording.
Thanks to both of you guys.
And thanks to Benjamin for organizing this.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone.